high, and these men will make sure you get the notes. This is the first Thursday night of the month, and each month I try to talk about some leadership issues that hopefully will be a help to you. These principles are applicable whether you are at church or you are working on a job or you own a business. The principles are all the same. They don't differ because they're God's principles, and so it really doesn't matter whether they're used in church or used somewhere else. And Nehemiah, you will remember, was a slave, and he'd been carried away captive. He was a cupbearer for the king, and over in the area now known as Iraq, and that part of the world. And he had heard news about his city, Jerusalem, how the temple had been destroyed and the walls and the gates were burnt with fire, the walls were broken down. And this broke his heart, and for many, many days he grieved and wept and prayed, and he had little joy. And on one occasion he stood before the king, and the king saw his countenance was sad. And of course this troubled the king because, you know, the reason you have a cupbearer is he tastes of the drink before you drink it. And if he drops dead, well, you know not to drink it. So he thought Nehemiah might have been up to something, and so he wanted to know what was wrong with him. And Nehemiah said he greatly feared, said this to himself, and he had a word of prayer in his heart and asked God to give him wisdom. And he explained to the king what the situation was in his hometown at Jerusalem and the temple and the walls, etc. And the king says, well, what do you want? Now certainly Nehemiah had been praying and hoping that God would open a door for him. And now there's one big enough to drive a truck through. The king says, what do you want? He said, I'd like to have leave to go back and build a city. The king said, how long will you be gone? So he said, I gave him a time. And he said, is there anything else you want? And so he began to give his grocery list. He said, I want some soldiers to go with me to protect us. I want a letter from you giving us permission to travel and to cut timber out of the forest. And so he asked for all of these, and he got all of them. And that certainly didn't make their enemies happy, so Nehemiah went. He spent a few days looking over the situation, and he didn't tell anybody what God had put in his heart. And finally, he began to rally the troops, and he began to organize the people, and they began to build the wall. Of course, they had opposition. You will always have opposition when you try to do right, you try to get anything done. So just expect it. And we spent several times talking about how to deal with the opposition and what Nehemiah did. Now the wall, when we come to this point, Nehemiah, here in chapter 5, talks about how he resisted temptation as a leader. And if you look down in verse 14 of chapter 5, he said, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor, he's talking to God here, in the land of Judea, from the 20th year even unto the 32 or the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor. Now you may want to underline that because that's part of what we'll talk about. I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor. Verse 15, but the former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people, and had taken of them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants bear rule over the people, but so did not I, because of the fear of God. You may want to underline that. but so did not I. So he's saying, I didn't do what the former governors and their servants did. Yea, also, verse 16, I continued in the work of this wall. Neither bought we any land, and all my servants were gathered there to the work. So he said, we didn't just sit back and watch it happen. We were there. We rolled up our sleeves and got involved, I and my servants. Moreover, verse 17, and there were at my table 150 of the Jews, rulers, besides those that came unto us from among the heathen that are about us. Now that which was prepared for me daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep also, fowls, were prepared for me, and once in 10 days' store of all sorts of wine. Yea, yet for all this required not I the bread of the governor. So you may want to underline that. Yet for not all this required not I the bread of the governor, because the bondage was heavy upon this people. And then he concludes in verse 19, think upon me, O God, or my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. So Nehemiah is praying, and he's asking God to be considerate of his burden for his people, and for his sacrifice, and for his refusal to take advantage of God's people. And so when we think about leadership, obviously it is a position. It doesn't make you a leader, but if you've been in any kind of a leadership role, then you do have a position there, and there are some advantages to it. And your position, you can become more than you were before. You have some power, authority. You can do more. You should be able to. And then you have a privilege in that. You can have more. So there are some advantages to leadership. These, I believe, are legitimate benefits of leadership. There's nothing wrong with those statements. And so the extra effort that you put in and the work you put in, it gets you more positions in most cases. People are not promoted because they're lazy. They're not promoted because they're indifferent. They're promoted because the people in authority see in them ability and commitment and loyalty and all the factors that go with it. And with each of these privileges certainly comes temptations, because power can be abused. And we see that in government all the time, and we see it in religious leaders and teachers and people in authority. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter. People are people. And so you turn on the 6 o'clock news, and you will hear of somebody abusing their power. And so there's a warning. There's a great temptation, and it can be your downfall. You can misuse leadership. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, it says, wherefore let him that thinketh he stand take heed lest he fall. And people who've been successful and who've been promoted and have positions of leadership many times have a confidence that can be their undoing. They think all of a sudden they think they're invincible. They think that that they can't be tempted, or their position, they think there's a power with it that protects them. And nothing could be further from the truth. So we're going to talk about the temptations of leadership and what the antidote is. And I mentioned to you the background of Nehemiah. We read in verse 14 that he'd been the governor now 12 years. So 12 years have passed since the wall was finished. And he identifies that some of the governors before him were different. He contrasts himself with them. They misused their power, and they misused their privileges, and certainly they misused their position. Now, I want to talk to you about three temptations of leadership. First of all, you will be tempted to misuse your position. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean you should do it. You should not. You should never abuse your position. But these former governors had done that. If you look at verse 15, and they'd made unrealistic demands on their people. He said, the former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people and had taken of them bread and wine. They were not only taking money from them, and notice it says, besides 40 shekels of silver. So they not only were taking money from the people, they were taking bread and food from them. They were taxing them. That's a good way to rob people. Thou shalt not steal. But so what you do is you impose a tax. That way you can do it legally. But you've seen people that many times they're at work and they've been promoted, and all of a sudden they become little dictators. And, it changes them. Some guy will be on an assembly line, he gets promoted to lead or a supervisor, and all of a sudden he's got a different personality. And he becomes a different guy once he gets promoted. And all of a sudden he starts treating everybody in a demeaning way, a demeaning fashion, talking down to them, talking rough to them. These are unrealistic demands that they demoralize people. So you can misuse your power. Leadership doesn't mean that you have the right to demean people. It doesn't mean that you're in a position of demoralizing. It really means that you should be an example and set the standard. Now, another thing is you'll be tempted to abuse your power. Verse 15, he goes on to say that, I did not because I feared God, in the last part of verse 15. And theirs was an oppressive leadership style. Someone asked the question, what leadership style do you think is the best? I think the one that gets the job done is probably the best. But I know I worked for Fisher Body, and I was telling my son Rocky about this fellow. I was, part of the time I worked there, I did vinyl tops, put vinyl tops on cars. But at another time I worked for some time as a relief man. And so I would go down the line and give a fellow a 15-minute break and do his job, and it might be putting windshields in, and then I would go to the next station and give another man a 15-minute break. And I would do that, all night long, giving different breaks. And so, but none of these men were my foreman. I had my own foreman, praise God for that. And I never knew where he was, and he probably didn't know where I was. But I remember one station where they put the rear windows in the car, in the new cars. And I'll never forget this boss. He was on to his crew all the time. And he would just give them what for and then turn around and grin, when he had his back turned. And I said to him one time, I said, why are you always picking on these guys? And he said, hey, when people are mad, they work harder. I thought, yeah, and they sabotage things too, But that's his philosophy. His philosophy is to keep everybody mad and they'll work harder. Well, there's some truth in that, Do you ever see your wife when she gets mad, how she cleans up the house? And, usually with you. But that's a dangerous way to lead people. I mean, you keep people mad at you, they're probably going to, you'll be surprised what they'll do. You'll be surprised. And so, Even his servants, the servants of these governors, if you look at verse 15, but not only were these former governors abusive in their power, but even their servants were abusive. The people under leadership under them. And I guess that's what you would expect, because they had learned from their leader. And they had learned a style of leadership, and they were passing that on to people underneath them. And so it's easy to abuse leadership. Let me just say this about leadership. It is not lordship. It is not lordship. You're not anybody's Lord. You're not anybody's God. The Bible said, "Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls." And you're a servant, and you have a master, if you're a Christian, and you're going to give an account to him. And so you ought to exercise the kind of leadership that the Lord exercises on you. Now think about that. Do you realize that the Lord had enough confidence in the body of Christ to go to heaven and sit at the right hand of God and believe that the work was going to get done? And you know why the work gets done? It gets done because people love Him. That's why. And there's a lot more truth to that than you realize. You know, there's something about wanting to do good things for people that are good to you and people that you love. See? And see, once his income satisfies that need, income no longer becomes a motivating factor. If a man is starving, he'll work for anything. But once his belly's full, and he's got enough to eat, and he's got a little money, money no longer becomes the motivator. There's something else. There's another factor that comes in here. And so, you may lord it over people that are destitute and desperate, but you will not lord it over people that, I told a guy the other day, he was telling me about how his boss talked to him. I said, he'd talked to me that way one time. And I mean it. One time. And I would say to him, I'd say to my boss, I'd say, now look, if I'm not doing my job right, you tell me what's wrong and I'll fix it. If I can't fix it, I'll quit. But you're not going to talk to me like I'm a dog. Now, if I was starving, I'd get on hands and knees and bark. If I was starving, and you would too. That's the truth. If you were starving, you would. But in a culture, in a society where most people are not starving, they're not going to put up with abuse. And it doesn't matter anyway. As Christians, we should not be abusive to people, to anybody or anything. So leadership, just because you have a position, doesn't mean you can lord it over people. You're the same person. And so number 3, you'll be tempted to profit from your privileges. The abuse of privileges. The American Express commercial said membership has its privileges. So does leadership. And usually leaders are paid more. They have more benefits. They have more freedom from their schedules and expense accounts. But many people can't handle that. I told my wife just the other day, I said that Open Door, we have a credit card that we use to purchase items, and we pay it up every month. So there's no interest on it. We buy materials or whatever, and it's paid up every month. And some of these credit cards is you can, every time you buy something, you can get some benefits. You understand me? I told my wife, I said that I do not want a benefit credit card for our church. Who'd get the benefits? You understand what I'm telling you? See, I would not take the benefits from a credit card that I would use to buy things for Open Door Baptist Church. In my opinion, that's crooked. Do you understand what I just said? See? Now, you got your own credit card and you buy things and you get mileage and you get benefits. Fine, do it. But you cannot personally profit off of other people and the organization. You understand that? Over the years, we've had people to come through here, want to sell everything. They get our people involved in Amway and A.L. Williams and Tupperware and everything else. And I've had people to want me to get involved in it. I said, I'm not going to do it. Not one bit. And I never have and never will. I'll tell you why. I do not want to have any other business than getting people saved and teaching the Word of God. And if I ever got involved in that kind of stuff, I would be profiting off of you. You understand me? And I'm not going to do it. I don't want to look at you and think I can profit personally from you. I was telling Jason today, if somebody put $1 million in the offering here at Open Door Baptist Church, he wouldn't be any better off. I would. No, not really. Neither one of us would. Neither one of us would. You would be as a total church, but no individual should profit from it, you see. And so you'll be tempted to profit from your privileges. And so that's why you better keep accurate records. If you're in leadership, you better keep accurate records. First of all, to avoid all appearances of evil. But secondly, you're going to give an account to God. You are. And Nehemiah said in verse 15, I did not act like that. He said, I didn't profit from that position of governor. That's what he made it very clear. And so he was a nonconformist, you know. He didn't follow the expected pattern. And, they had all these governors before them, and they ripped everybody off. And Nehemiah comes in, and he doesn't rip anybody off. And the reason is, that he feared God. That's what he said in the text. I feared God. And dishonesty shows you don't fear God. Dishonesty shows you don't believe God. It's all an act of unbelief. I don't care how you slice it and dice it. It says, I don't fear God, I don't believe God, and if I'm honest, my needs won't be met. So if I'm dishonest, I'll take things into my own hands, and everything will be okay. So it really is a character problem. So he said, I didn't take any money, I didn't make any money. In fact, he said, we didn't buy any land or build any houses. That's what he said. There in verse 16, I also continued in the work of this wall, neither bought we any land, and all my servants were gathered there to the work. So he's just basically saying that I didn't abuse my leadership position. And he could have. And you can always abuse a position. And the more you're promoted, the greater the temptation. That's why many, many people are promoted to their own destruction. They cannot withstand the temptations to abuse their power. Bill Clinton is a prime example of a man who abused power. The Enron crowd was an abuse of power, and so on. And like I said, check the 6 o'clock news tomorrow night, and you'll see the same thing. Now, how do you keep your integrity? I preached just a few Sundays ago about how you need to live in this world, and one of the points was you need integrity. Integrity is the whole person. It's the integral part of the individual. You can live your life in segments without integrity, and you can actually be honest in some segments and not have integrity. I've heard folks say, well, you catch them stealing. They say, well, I'm not going to lie about it. All of a sudden, they've got integrity in the truth, but they're still thieves. You know, you see people like that. They think, I'm honest here, but I'm dishonest here. That's a total lack of integrity. Integrity is you are what you are everywhere all the time. You're the same person in church or at home as you are in church. You're the same person at work. I worked with guys at Fisher Body and other places, professed to be Christians, and I was ashamed of them. They were vile, and they talked dirty and lewd and were vulgar. Hey, I worked at the railroad. I worked with the railroad. I remember the guy's name. I'd know him if he walked in this room. He was the treasurer of a Missionary Alliance church, which is a good church. They're a good group. He was the treasurer. And that guy was he was the most vile person at work. I mean, he was filthy. Dirty talk, dirty books, all the time. But boy, he shined at church. So he had no integrity. And so you have to guard your integrity as a leader. And the way you do that is you have to deepen your reverence for God. You deepen your reverence for God. Nehemiah wanted to please God more than he wanted to please men or himself. And you're going to have to get to the place to where you want to please God. He says, out of fear of God. He said, I didn't act that way. He said, I feared God. So what does it mean to fear God? Well, it means a few things. First of all, it means I realize that God put me in this position. Did you know the Bible said promotion comes not from the east or the west, but it comes from the Lord? And so you have to realize that God put you in this position. That's what Nehemiah recognized. He recognized that when he prayed, the king said, what do you want? The king gave it all to him, and God blessed his efforts. And so, you know, he was clear that God was in what he was trying to do. And so he never forgot that God, you know, sent him back to Jerusalem. And God gave him that project. He never forgot that God put him there. And you have to ask yourself the question, you know, did you pray for the job you've got? If you did and you got it, then God put you there. He put you there anyway. That's God's way of providing for you. And so you need to have reverence for God in this matter. That's where promotion comes from. And someone said, you don't need to know who the key men are, you need to know who holds the keys. And that's God. He opens and no man can shut, and He shuts and no man can open. Secondly, you have to realize that God is holding you accountable. Verse 9. And God holds us accountable. And I think one of the reasons that people do things is that they don't fear God. They think God won't hold them accountable. They think they can play games and get away with it. And it just becomes a little cat and mouse game. And life becomes that way. And there's just a little shade of dishonesty. And they think that nobody sees it. See? They're too clever. And they think that God's not going to hold them accountable for it. And thirdly, there is no authority without accountability. People want authority many times without accountability. The more authority you have, the more accountable you are. You become more accountable, not less accountable. You say, well, I've been promoted and raised up, therefore, I'm not as accountable as you're more accountable now. The Bible says that we in leadership as pastors and teachers will receive the greater judgment. You see. Turn to the book of Hebrews with me and look at chapter 13. Hebrews chapter 13. Way over to the right. Hebrews chapter 13, and I think it's about verse, I think that's the one I want, verse 17. It says, obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourself, watch it, for they watch for your souls, now here it is, as they that must give an account. People in leadership have to give an account of their leadership. You're accountable. You're responsible. And so he says, obey those that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give an account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that's unprofitable for you. So people in leadership, missionaries and pastors and teachers are accountable as to how faithful they are. See, there's far more to teaching than a lesson. I'm telling you, you are the lesson. Folks think the curriculum is the lesson. Why, the best teacher can take the worst material and make a good lesson out of it. And the sorriest teacher can take the best material and present a sorry lesson. You're the lesson. You know what? Most of you do not remember anything that your teachers taught you as far as material is concerned. But you remember the teacher. And you think back, some of you right now, some of you think back when you were children and so on, and the thing you remember is the influence of the teacher. Right? I think of my college days. You know, the first guy I think about is Dr. Vanneman. And the example and the influence he was. I think about Miss Irma when I was a kid in grade school. You know, I didn't learn anything what she taught, but boy, I tell you what, I learned from her. She's a good, godly woman. And she put the first influence, probably one of the first influence in my life to trust God. And I look back over these years, and there are certain teachers that stand out. But as far as the curriculum and the materials, that thing is stored back there somewhere. Doesn't mean that much. You're the lesson. You know, this sermon I'm preaching, most folks will never remember it. They won't remember it. Most of you won't remember it next week. You know what you'll remember? You'll remember Pastor Blue being here 38 years. That's what you'll remember. You'll remember how I respond to certain situations because you watch. See, that's what people, you're the lesson. You're the sermon. And if a person thinks, I can just get an outline and that's the message, you're sadly mistaken. You are the message. The Bible said we are epistles known and read of all men. Someone said, I'd far rather see a sermon than hear one. A young preacher got up to preach a sermon that he'd found in a book somewhere, and which was fine, and he preached it at a meeting with many, many pastors there, and he preached that message. And it was an excellent message. And an elderly gentleman who'd been pastoring for many, many years said, son, how long did it take you to get that sermon? He said, a couple of hours. The old man said, it took me 30 years. I think you know what I'm saying. So he had a deep reverence for God, and you have to realize that God put you in that position. You have to realize that God does hold you accountable, and you also have to realize that there's no authority without accountability. And so as a leader, I'm called accountable before God. I have to be not only accountable to you. You say, well, preacher, how do members hold pastors and staff accountable? I tell you how they do it. One is they quit coming. They quit coming. They quit giving. They quit cooperating. I mean, there's ways they hold them accountable. And then God holds us accountable. The second thing you have to do to keep your integrity as a leader, you have to develop a love for people. You have to develop a love for people. Nehemiah was a man of compassion and a man of concern. He really cared for people. And you know how I know he cared for people? was the price he paid for them. It wasn't that what he told them, it's what he did. And he served 12 years out of his own pocket. Who's above criticism? Nobody. And I probably get criticized for mentioning the person, but so be it. But let me give you two examples. One is Dr. Criswell. How many of you ever heard of Dr. Criswell? Most of you. He's the president of the Southern Baptist Convention many, many years. Built the huge First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas. He's a master when it came to preaching and leadership. It's kind of like Lee Roberson and Jerry Falwell and up in that category. He bought him a life insurance policy many years ago. He made it for several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he made his church, First Baptist Church, the beneficiary. He worked it out so that when he died, his insurance would pay as much as his salary had been for all the years he'd been there. So when it was all over with, he gave his total salary back to the church in the form of an insurance policy. Rick Warren, you've heard of Rick Warren? Rick Warren pastors a church down in, what's that town? Saddleback, California. Is it Saddleback, California? That doesn't sound right. It's down there somewhere. It doesn't matter. Anyway, he wrote a book that has really become one of the best sellers in the world. It's called The Purpose-Driven Church. Well, he wrote that one too. That was his second one. The Purpose-Driven Church has become one of the best sellers in the world. And he has either taken all of the royalties from that book and given it all to the church. It's either that way, or he's taken the royalties for the book and no salary from his church whatsoever. One or the other. And I think that, some men are able to do that. But it tells you something about their heart, that they're not greedy. And they love their people. And you find out, you find out really how much you love people by what you're willing to pay, what you're willing to sacrifice. And you see this here in Nehemiah. Look at verse 17 back in chapter 5. Moreover, there were at my table 150 of the Jews, rulers, beside those that came to us from among the heathen. And he said, basically, I paid out of my own pocket for these 150 Jews that ate at my table. All right, now let me give you a leadership law here. Let me say that losers focus on what they can get, and leaders focus on what they can give. People, you remember Jesus Christ for what He sacrificed for you. That's why you remember Him. And when you study leaders, there's good leaders and bad leaders, and there are those that abuse their power, and there are those that love people. You see it in a Sunday school class. You see a teacher that loves their students, and the students are drawn to this person. Even a dog knows if you like them. And you take Mrs. Parks. Here she was in her 80s, and her girls loved her, and because they knew that she loved them. And then number 3, discipline yourself for eternal rewards. Nehemiah was not caught up in the rat race like others because he wasn't looking for anything temporal. And everything you see tonight's temporal. That cell phone that you can't put down is temporal. It'll be junk here in just another few months. that computer that's got you tied to it is temporal. The car that you're so crazy about will be in the junkyard pretty soon. It's all going to be there. Just drive down the road and look at all the junkyards. Those used to be new cars. See? And you ought to thank God for what you've got, but you ought to put it in proper perspective. The same with your house. All it is just a bunch of lumber nailed together in a box shape. And you get your toys and move inside it. And everything in it is going to the welfare, the goodwill, or to the dump. All the clothes in your closet, all the furniture you sit on, every bit of it. It's just temporal. And we act like it's eternal. The things which are seen are temporal. The things not seen are eternal. The things not seen are eternal. And Nehemiah was looking to the future. And that's how he could stay focused. That's how he could stay honest. He was looking to the future. And leaders who misuse their position, abuse their power, and exploit people, or people they're trying to get rich. And they're trying to use people. Jason and I had this talk earlier today, a lengthy talk about this matter of people who set their mind and their heart on money. It's not a worthy goal. The Bible says riches make themselves to have wings, they fly away. And Paul said people who covet after riches pierce themselves through with many sorrows. Not only that, when riches become the objective, you know what people are to you? They're just a means to your objective. And you don't love them, you use them. Or abuse them. And you see them in a totally different light. Everybody now is a means for your personal gain. And you don't want to get there. That's a miserable place to be. It's a wicked place to be. And so Paul warns against it. And so the thing you have to discipline yourself is for eternal rewards. You are going to be judged. You're going to stand before the Lord, and He'll be able to look right through you like a glass of water. And He'll see all the little bugs swimming around in there. Say, you'll be transparent. And that's why you need to pray and work at being transparent now. Say, nobody's perfect, but you ought to want to be. And nobody's perfect, but you can be honest. And you can realize that one of these days that, you know what? I'd hate to live 60, 70, or 80 years, get everything I can here, and lose everything when I die. Wouldn't it be something, boy, look at what a casket they buried him in. What a funeral. Look at all the flowers. Look at it. Did you see the hearse that they took him to the graveyard in? They buried him in a Cadillac. Man, that's living. And you step out into eternity and you're a pauper, you're a beggar. You got nothing. It's wood, hay, and stubble. If I were you, I'd want to reverse it. I want to reverse it. Now here's a leadership law. Losers focus on their rights. Leaders focus on their responsibilities. You cannot be in leadership and worry about your rights. It won't work. It won't work. All right? So let's wind this thing up, shall we? All right. So you have to discipline yourself. You have to keep your eye on the goal. I want you to go to Matthew 25 with me. Matthew chapter 25. And notice in this parable of the talents, chapter 25, and down about verse 23. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Now there's some key words in that verse. One is good. One is faithful. Few things. I will make you ruler over many things. If you can't be faithful over the little things, why should anyone give you greater things? If you couldn't be faithful in what I give you, or if you can't be faithful in that which belongs to somebody else, who will give you your own? There's a song. You've heard the song. And I read the poem many years ago, and the guy, was it Adkins? Dan Adkins wrote a song. This is Your House. Remember that song? I love that song. I asked him, I said, did you write that? He said, yeah. I said, I heard that poem many years ago. He said, yeah, I know. I put it into a song. But the story is something like this. There was a very, very wealthy contractor. He built homes. And he had a foreman that worked for him that hated his boss because his boss was very, very rich. And he just had enough to get by. But he'd been working for this boss for 10 or 15 years. And he hated him. So the boss went to Hawaii on vacation. And he gave an assignment for this foreman to build a house down here on, what's it down here on the point where these big houses are? That'll work. Picnic Point. And so the foreman had a job to build a house down at Picnic Point. And he thought, this is my chance. So he bought the cheaper lumber and charged more for it. He put down that he bought X number of nails, but he only put half that much into the building. And he cut corners everywhere he could and pocketed the money. The first wind that came along would probably blow the house over. When the vacation was over, his boss came back and he said, let's look at the house you built. And he took his foreman down and showed it to him. And the foreman reached in the pocket and said, I've been wanting to do something for you. Here's the keys to the house. He'd cheated himself. I don't know, maybe when you walk into the presence of the Lord, He'll say, here's the key to your house. You can decide on how you're going to build it. You build it with honesty. You build it with integrity. You deal it with love for God's people. You deal it with love for Jesus Christ. That's how you build. Gold, silver, and precious stones. The other option is wood, hay, and stubble. You're the builder. Christ is the foundation. You need to take heed how you build. That's why this man is in the book, this Nehemiah. That's why he's in this book. Because he was a man of integrity, a man that loved God, and a man that God could use. I want God to use you. He wants to use you. But you have to be faithful.